Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're now starting this webinar session. My name is Alan Wittig from the BRS Secretariat, and together with my colleague Agustin Hart, we will like to welcome you to this webinar briefing on the updated draft guidance on the identification and management of sites contaminated by POPs on behalf of the co-lead drafters and experts of the Joint Toolkit and Buttonweb expert roster, Mr. Lee Bell, who is nominated by IPEN, and Mr. Ulwin Foke, who is nominated by the International HCH and Pesticides Association. During this webinar, the co-lead drafters will provide you information on the current status of the guidance, which has been developed over several years, and which has gone through a number of revisions and review steps. Information will also be provided on the remaining steps towards its finalization. This will be followed by a questions and answer session during which you will have an opportunity to seek clarifications and provide comments, and this session will be moderated by Agustin. If you have any specific questions during the presentation as it's ongoing, you can send them through the chat message, and these will be taken up and brought up and addressed during the Q&A session. But you'll also have an opportunity to raise your hand and take the floor during the Q&A session following the presentation. The webinar session will last around 1.5 hours. This is the second of two webinars, which we're covering actually the same content and agenda. These were scheduled at two different times to cover the different time zones, and the first session was actually held this morning, today, 10 a.m. in Geneva time. And just to provide a short reminder or briefing of the history of the development of the guidance, it was first discussed and its drafting was initiated in 2016 and 2017 by the BAT and BEP experts, with the aim to guide parties in the identification, assessment, management, and remediation of POPs contaminated sites. And it has since undergone a number of revisions and review steps. In more recent years, as one of the key steps in the reviewing process, parties and observers were invited to provide comments on an initial draft version of the guidance in 2021. Then in October, at the meeting in October 2022, the BAT and BEP experts discussed the updated draft and agreed to that further work was actually needed to finalize the guidance for its consideration by the 12th meeting of the Conference of the Parties in May 2025. The experts agreed on the main steps to do so, and this work plan was then endorsed by COP11 in May 2023. Then at their meeting in November 2023, the BAT and BEP experts discussed the latest version of the guidance, and they agreed to a specific work plan for the further review and finalization of the guidance during this current intersessional period for consideration by COP10. And this is the slide you have on the screen, and in bold is basically the step we are now, the current step of review. So this work plan includes included one round of comments by the BAT and BEP experts earlier this year, and then another round of comments by parties, observers, the BAT and BEP experts, and other relevant experts. And this is the current step we're at now. And as part of this review step, this call for comments was actually also shared with other expert processes and bodies, such as the POPs Review Committee members, the members of the Basel Convention Small Intersessional Working Group on POPs Waste, and the members of the Stockholm Convention Small Intersessional Working Group on PCB. So initially, the deadline for this latest round of comments was set for 1 July, and this was on the version of the guidance dated May 2024. So this is the most recent version, and this deadline was subsequently extended to 1 August 2024. So we're still within this commenting period. A communication was sent on 1st of May to all Stockholm Convention parties and observers, together with a form for providing comments. And then a reminder communication was sent on 4th of July announcing this extension of the deadline. The comments received to date have been made available on the website of the convention, on the BATS and BEP web pages, and I'll provide you the link in the chats later for ease of reference. The comments will be taken into account in the next version of the guidance and compiled also and made available in advance of the next meeting of the BAT and BEP experts, which is scheduled to be held from 8 to 10 October this year in Geneva. And then the final version, as I indicated, the final version of the guidance will be made available for consideration by COP12, taking place in May next year. So just as a reminder, if you wish to submit written comments on the guidance, you may send them to the Secretariat, basically myself, and I'll provide you my email in the chat using the form for providing comments. And this is available also on the website by 1st of August. So there's still a bit of time if you wish to submit some written comments for the attention of the drafters and the experts. So with these few words, I'll pass on the floor now to the lead drafters, Mr. Lee Bell and Mr. Baudouin Fouquet, who will walk you through the presentation on this guidance and its current status. And Lee will start us off. So Lee, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, and to the Secretariat and support staff who've been able to make this webinar possible. And thank you all attendees and participants for taking the time to listen to this update of the guidance and our summary of the recent review process. So our presentation tonight on the, or depending on where you are in the morning or afternoon, and for me it's the evening, the guidance on sites contaminated by POPs. It's a webinar for Stockholm Convention official contact points, national focal points, observers and BAT-BEP experts. And I'll cover the first few slides, and Baudouin and I will swap a little between slides as we go. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the content of the presentation is the 9 modules of the guidance itself. There is a 10th module, but that's a case study which we won't be discussing tonight. But for all intents and purposes, it's these 9 modules listed, which starts with an introduction and an executive summary, followed by Module 1, which is the background on POPs contaminated sites, Module 2, which is the principles and approaches for POP contaminated sites management and remediation, Module 3 covers site investigation, assessment, and the development of the very important conceptual site model. Module 4 details environmental risk assessment. Module 5, remediation technologies and techniques. Module 6 is a technology selection tool example for remedial options that can be used in phase 3 of the remediation assessment, and we'll explain the phases of remediation assessment as well as tiers of risk assessment as we move through the presentation. And so Module 6 and Module 5 are linked in the sense that Module 5 covers the technologies and techniques that are available, and Module 6 guides you through how you might select different technologies and techniques for a particular site. Module 7 covers a very important issue of stakeholder engagement and related public worker safety and health. Module 8 is contaminated sites remediation and monitoring and aftercare, an aspect of contaminated sites management that is often overlooked, which is the long-term monitoring and aftercare required to deal with residual risks on a site. And finally, Module 9 brings all of these elements together for all of the modules, and it's entitled Getting Started: Legislation, Policy, Inventory Development and Financing Remediation. And the objective of Module 9 is to pull together all of these elements into a coherent framework for the intended audience, which I should just elaborate on for a moment. The intended audience for this guidance is not highly developed countries with well-developed contaminated sites frameworks for management and financing. This is designed for countries that are very early on in the development of their contaminated sites framework, or have none at all, or who are looking to improve their rudimentary contaminated sites framework and build upon the work of others in other locations. So the intended audience is really for those who have very limited contaminated sites management capacity, infrastructure and framework at this point. And I just bear that in mind if people are providing comments on the draft guidance, that it's not intended to duplicate national guidance somewhere in Europe or the US. It's actually designed for preparing a coherent contaminated sites framework where there currently isn't one. Next slide, please. So in terms of the general introduction, the underlying theme of this guidance is the sustainable management of POP contaminated sites. And sustainable management and environmentally sound management of sites are looking at a holistic approach, which employs strategies for cleanups that use natural resources and energy efficiently, reduce negative impacts on the environment, minimize or eliminate pollution at the source, protect and benefit the community at large, and use sustainability principles such as precaution, intergenerational equity, polluter pays, and so on. It's also looking at developing site-specific target levels depending on the intended site use, and that's an important issue. If you intend to use the site for industrial purposes, you may have different target levels compared to a residential site. And these may vary per POP type or combination of POPs contaminants. So site-specific target levels are very important to determine how the remediation will be conducted and the ultimate goals of it. We also look at contaminated groundwater, which should be treated to restore the highest level of functionality and minimize contamination levels. And we consider contaminated soil to only be a waste when it has lost all of its soil functions. Functional soil should be conserved wherever possible for ecological and economic reasons, and its POP concentration lowered to levels below acceptable risk levels for potential receptors by using sustainable management and remediation techniques. If POP contaminated soil has lost its function and is deemed to be POP's waste, it should be subject to Article 6 of the Stockholm Convention and the Basel General Technical Guidelines on POPs waste, which provides more detail on how to deal with that form of POPs waste. Next slide, please. So in terms of a general introduction and the management guidance, you can see to the left of the screen that the guidance management of POPs contaminated sites that falls within the Stockholm guidance section is looking at POP contaminated soil, groundwater, sediment, and building material, which is often neglected. Many contaminated sites have buildings on them that have become contaminated through absorption into bricks or cement or other materials, and may also need remedial treatment. And also looking at waste below the low POP content level in terms of remediation. From the site remediation, residues will be generated. If they're above low POP content levels, then they are POPs waste to be dealt with under the requirements of the General Technical Guidelines. And if there is waste on site that is above the low POP content level, bags of used out-of-date DDT, pesticide barrels, those sorts of things where there's a obvious waste material that needs to be removed and it's above the low POP content level, that also needs to be treated as POPs waste. Next slide, please. So moving on to the first module, the background on POPs contaminated sites. I've mentioned already the intended audience. This is not for well-developed contaminated sites regulatory departments. This is for an audience where they have a limited framework in place and they want to improve it or develop one from scratch. In this area, in this particular module, we look at threshold levels for POPs, and legal and technical issues that define a contaminated site. And they do vary to some extent between different countries, how they define a contaminated site and what that means in their legislation and policy. But for typical guidance, we look at comparison of sampling data with background levels, and also the comparison of sampling data with soil screening levels, and the development of site-specific screening levels and risk assessment, as these are the basic issues involved in determining whether a site is contaminated or not. And we include a section on the fate and transport of POPs. We've moved from typically chlorinated POPs, and we've seen more recently brominated POPs listed under the convention, and now some that are not in the halogenated family. We've seen POP PFASs and UV328. So we talk a little bit about the fate and transport of POPs, and also take into account issues related to PFAS contamination in later modules. Next slide, please. Defining contaminated sites in Module 1, we do look at the issue of contaminated sites and explain the rationales behind the definitions, as well as giving examples from some country. And we also need to recognize that defining a site is not just a technical issue, but it's a combination of legal, technical, and social elements that include the use of thresholds and screening levels for POPs in soil, sediment, and groundwater to determine if the site meets the technical definition of contaminated. But there's also legal elements of the definition which may mandate how a site should be treated, whether and how its ownership might be transferred, who's responsible for its management, and how that's conducted once it's deemed to be a contaminated site. Other social elements of the definition might refer to the land use and permit different levels of risk or contamination according to whether it's residential, commercial, or industrial. And some countries use things like open parkland and recreational sites as well. So the social use and the land use issues also help determine what is considered contaminated. And finally, in Module 1, describes the characteristics of key POPs in terms of their fate and transport, how they behave in the soil and in groundwater, how they behave during degradation, and how it's relevant to the management and remediation of these sites. And the objective of this module is to assist policymakers and regulators to consider these key elements when they're developing or updating their national definitions of contaminated sites. Next slide, thank you. And I think I hand over here to Bodwin.
Yes, I had to unmute. Thank you, Lee, and thank you for this kicking off the webinar. I also want to thank everybody for making this webinar possible, and the audience for their interest, and of course for their input on the draft one. I will proceed with the presentation on Model 2, and Model 2, the title is Principles and Approach for POPs Contaminated Site Management and Remediation. And the table of contents is our introduction, and after introduction, we introduce the risk-based approach, then followed by the cost-benefit analysis. Then we have some words about the multi-criterion analysis for remediation assessment. Then we explain what green remediation and sustainable remediation is, and then we bring it all together and recommend a phased approach. Next slide, please. So the objective of Model 2 are to clarify what is green and sustainable management of contaminated sites, a risk-based approach, holistic approach, as Lee already mentioned, considering associated economical, social, and cultural issues. Another objective of this model is to highlight the difference between POPs contaminated sites and sites contaminated with other chemicals of concern. Then the third objective of Model 2 is to explain the importance of including social and cultural values of ethnic minority groups directly affected in the cost-benefit analysis. And we introduce the stepwise phased approach of the sustainable management of contaminated sites. Next slide, please. So here are the first three phases of the stepwise phased approach of the management of these contaminated sites. I've listed here the phases with the specific deliverable of each phase. So each phase concludes with the following deliverables. Phase 1 is called the preliminary site investigation, and when it's finished, you have an initial conceptual site model and results of a tier 1 or preliminary risk assessment. The output of phase 1 is the input of phase 2, and phase 2 is called the detailed site investigation. To bridge these two, we have a gap analysis of the initial conceptual site model. With the gap analysis, we make a sampling and analysis plan, and then we carry out the site investigation. And with the information collected during the detailed site investigation, we improve our conceptual site model. Improved conceptual site model means that you picture, describe, use all kind of, let's say, diagrams and tables and photographs and pictures to explain the contaminated situation on site. When the improved conceptual site model is completed, you can carry out a tier 2 risk assessment or a tier 3 risk assessment. A risk assessment using all the data from the improved conceptual site model. When you have a clear understanding of the contaminated site situation on site and you know the risks, you can enter the next phase. You enter the next phase if, of course, when you have established risks, unacceptable risks. Phase 3 is the remediation assessment, and that comprises of the selection of remediation techniques for each site component, and I should say contaminant site component, and that can be soil, groundwater, sediments, buildings. The list Lee had in his diagram explained. After the selection of the remediation technique for each contaminated site component, you conceptual design remediation options describing feasible remediation measures for all site components. And then you have these remediation options. You select the best remedial option. And the best remedial option is using the best available technique, using environmentally sustainable methods while not incurring excessive costs, adjusted to the available resources to reduce as much as possible the environmental risks. And when you do this, sometimes you need to go back to the field to get additional information for certain techniques to be implemented. An example is if you want to do soil washing, you want to know the exact texture of the soil. So you take samples and you do analysis on the distribution of the particle size. And then this is additional information. This additional information is put to the conceptual site model. So that's why it's called a detailed conceptual site model. And with this detailed conceptual site model, you preliminarily design the best remedial options. Can I have the next slide? And when you have selected the best remedial options, you can enter, or you have to enter the remediation management phase 4. And in this phase, the one contracted should detail design the remediation so that it can be implemented. And what is the other, or what are the other deliverables of this phase? That is, eliminated acute risk, contain the remaining risk, and of course, an updated conceptual site model. Because if you do remediation, you change the situation on site and you have to record that. And we use the conceptual site model to keep track of the changes on your site. Often the remediation is completed, but then still there are remaining risks, and these remaining risks should be managed in the proper way, and therefore you enter into phase 5, which is called the site monitoring and aftercare. And the site monitoring and aftercare, of course, gives results of the monitoring. You keep track on the changes, for instance, the reduction of the concentration in the plume, and this information is also, again, used to update your conceptual site model on a regular basis. These are the 5 phases, and for each phase, it is necessary to appoint a responsible party, to contract the accountable party, and to establish the parties that should be informed on the progress of this management of sites. And the project planning of this whole, let's say, phased approach should be project specific, realistic in cost, time, and objectives. And you should work with a flexible work plan, because often you come across unexpected things in soil and groundwater and you have to deal with that. So please, if you start doing this and you plan your project, you should have some flexibility in time and cost. So budget. Please, can I have the next slide? Model 3. Model 3 is devoted to the site investigation, assessment, and conceptual site model. And this model first introduces the phase 1, the preliminary site assessment. It gives the objective and task, and then it deals with the different tasks in detail. So the desktop study, what do you have to do for the desktop study? The site visit, what has to be done on the site, photo reports, interviews with all kinds of stakeholders. Then a site reconnaissance survey, meaning that you want to reveal the most prominent aspects of a site. And then with all the information collected, you construct an initial conceptual site model. This section ends with the format of a reporting of a phase 1 of the phase 1 results. Then the next section is the same for the detailed site investigation. So we start with the objective and the task, and then we explain the task, gap analysis, the bridge between phase 1 and phase 2, field investigation, the installation of boreholes, the installation of monitoring wells, and then the data interpretation and evaluation. And with all the data collected in the investigation, the analytical results, the bore logs, you construct your initial conceptual site model to a conceptual site model and then this section also ends with the format of reporting the results. Can I have the next slide? Next slide, please. Here on this slide, I have summarized the strategy of a preliminary site investigation. It starts with collecting as much as possible already available site information. And these are site visit reports, site photo reports, survey reports, and archives. And of course, nowadays you can easily collect site images from the satellite, which is a great help in getting the first ideas of the situation on site. With all the information, you construct your initial conceptual site model, and an initial conceptual site model is complete when you have identified the potential source. In this case, it's very obvious, it's dumped material. Then the source receptor pathways, here indicated with the red arrow for the wind and the blue arrows for the infiltration and the groundwater flow. And then last but not least, the potential receptors, here on this small graph indicated with the green arrows. The initial conceptual site model can be subjected, or the information can be used to carry out a tier 1 risk assessment. In model 2, we do not, let's say, go into details of the risk assessment. We have devoted the next model, model 4, on the risk assessment, because it's an important aspect of the approach, the risk-based approach of this contaminated site management. But the deliverables of phase 1 are the input for phase 2. And on the next slide, I have done the same for phase 2, the strategy for phase 2, the detailed site investigation. Can I have the next slide? So here is the strategy for the detailed site investigation. The input are the deliverables of phase 1. And to bridge phase 1, phase 2, you carry out a gap analysis of the initial conceptual site model. With that information, you construct a sampling and analysis plan, in this picture indicated with the small stars on the satellite images. To carry out a site investigation, you need in some countries permits, but of course you need to know the cost of the investigation. A quality control and quality assurance plan has to be made, and a health and safety plan for the field survey has to be made before you go to the field. Nowadays, remote sensing recording using a drone is very easy and very cheap and gives you a very accurate actual site location map. And with that remote sensing image, you can go to the field and use as a site location map to record on that map all your field observations. And in the field observations are sampling of the soil, installing boreholes and taking samples, installing groundwater wells and taking groundwater samples, take sediment samples, and so on and so on. These samples are being packed preferably in containers provided by the lab, then under a cold chain, especially for volatile components. No, I still are on my slide before. Please, can you return? Yes, thank you very much. The samples are being packed in a cool box, so they should be transported to under a cold chain to the laboratory, and then of course within 24 hours they should be actually at the lab for the integrity of the samples. The samples are analyzed with all the results of the laboratory and the fields. You can add this to a geographic information system, a GIS, and with that you can make a digital train model. The digital train model made with the remote sensing recording and all the other information, you can construct your detailed conceptual site model. The detailed conceptual site model gives confirm the sources, confirm the source receptor pathways, and confirm the receptors. And with the information of the detailed conceptual site model, you can carry out tier 2 or a tier 3 risk assessment. The result of this phase phase 2 are the input of phase 3, the site remediation assessment. Can I have the next slide, please? I told you that we have devoted model 4 especially to the environmental risk assessment. We recognize 3 types of risk assessment. The first one is a tier 1, the second 2, tier 2, and then the tier 3 risk assessment. In section 2 of this model, it's explained what and when to use these different tiers. And then the last subsection of this is what are needed to perform these different risk assessments. And section 3 is used to explain in detail what a tier 1 risk assessment is, the methods and the results, how they are reported. Section 4 of model 4 is the same for tier 2 risk assessment. You need to have the improved conceptual site model, the methods, and how to present the results. And then we come to the tier 3 risk assessment. When a tier risk assessment is needed, the detailed conceptual site model needed for the information storage, the use of tier 3 risk assessment models. Then often you need contact sampling, that's discussed, and then advanced research methods for assessing adverse human effects is also addressed. And then of course the last is the tier 3 ecological risk assessment. All in one model for better understanding the differences. Can I have the next slide, please? The next slide is summarizing what a tier 1 risk assessment is, and it's actually a very simple, let's say, approach. On the left-hand side, you see a dump site with old DDT, with obsolete DDT. 2 boys, I took this picture myself, 2 boys were playing on this dump site. So the source of contamination is the dump site. You see the bags. The receptors are these 2 kids playing there. And the source receptor pathway is the movement of the hands with the waste and to their body. Now, it is needless to say that the impact of this, let's say, action by the children is large, and the likelihood that they come into contact is also very large. Now, you can use then a certain grading. So in this case, I have 6 points. So if you see on the right hand side at the top, I assess that this risk is having a likelihood which is very high and an impact which is also very high. So it's direct risks. Risk with a high impact and a low likelihood are called potential risk in this module. Risk with a low impact and a low likelihood are called latent risks. And last, risk with impact which is low and a likelihood which is high are called probable risk. The way to report is on an Excel file. Can you show me the Excel file? Okay, thank you very much. Here, this is also given in the model. On the left-hand side, on the top is a diagram, and there you put all your risk identifying with the help of an initial conceptual site model. You give them a number, and then you can assess the risk for human exposure, for ecological, and for transport. And you can give them a score from 1 to 6, and you multiply the likelihoods and the impact, and then you add the risk, and then you get a risk figure. This risk figure can be used to compare the different risks at a site, but you can also add all the risk of a site, and then you can compare the sites based on risks. And this is, let's say, the essential of the risk-based approach of the phase 1. Can I have the next slide? Now the next slide. Here we explain the tier 2 and tier 3 risk assessment. A tier 2 risk assessment, when do you carry it out? You carry this out when there's a need to establish if the concentration are less than or exceeding site use specific target reference values. The input for this risk assessment is an improved conceptual site model, and the method is comparison of concentration of source and pathway samples with existing reference values. And these reference values, which exist, many countries have their own specific reference values, are risk-based. If you don't have these reference values in your country yourself, you can select and then please select reference values which are, let's say, having more or less the same situation, local geology, history, and anthropogenic activity, climate difference, site-specific conditions, and country or regional specific. And therefore, identify how well reference values represent your location, your local situation, in order to select the most appropriate values. Then we come to the last, the most detailed risk assessment. And when do you carry it out? You carry out the detailed or the tier 3 risk assessment when the results of a tier 2 risk assessment indicate that mitigation measures demand major investment. You need more you need better understanding of the situation and that you justify high investment. When the results are not conclusive, when there is high stakeholder and public concern, you need a cost-benefit analysis of mitigating measures, and when the policy demands. The input for a tier 3 risk assessment is a completed detailed conceptual site model. Extra investigation might be needed. The method is modeling the fate and transport of the contaminant. And of course, also these reference values are risk-based, but they are now site-specific. These models are available on the internet, and we do list a set of these models in model 4. They include a collection of default transport parameters of various soil types. Default parameters should be selected and adapted to the on-site situation. And a tier risk assessment needs experts to be involved to carry this out and to get reliable results. Can I have the next slide? I think now I hand over to Lee.
Yes, thank you, Bodwin. Module 5 starts to look at the issue of remediation technologies and techniques that might be applied in POPs contaminated site situations. There's a number of sections where we look at POPs waste and POPs contaminated matrices, different definitions, destruction levels and pre-treatment that may be applied. Under section 2, we look at remediation techniques for soils and solids. This includes things beyond just destruction of waste. We look at bioremediation, phytoremediation using plants, soil reagents that might be used to help bind or remove contaminants and so forth. Under section 3, we start to discuss technologies and techniques for POPs management and destruction at contaminated sites. And we break down these issues in section 3 and 4 into non-combustion technologies and combustion technologies, with the main consideration being sustainability outcomes when you're considering combustion technologies that might generate further Annex C contaminants, materials like dioxins and dioxin-like PCBs as a part of emissions or releases from the use of those technologies, even though you're using them to destroy different types of POPs waste or contamination. So there is a discussion of the advantages and disadvantages relative to those issues. We also have some examples of treatment trains where you join a number of techniques or technologies together with the intention of looking to minimize the amount of concentrated POPs that need to be destroyed. So you might take thousands of tons or hundreds of tons of soil and remove the POPs from them and then destroy a relatively small amount of POPs rather than trying to process very large amounts of soil through treatment techniques. Under section 6, we look at remediation techniques for groundwater contaminated with POPs. And under section 7, we have a dedicated section on PFAS in groundwater. And while not all PFAS are listed as POPs, there are POP PFASs such as PFOA and PFOS, PFHXS, but they tend not to occur in isolation. Perhaps they do in cases, but they generally occur with other PFAS compounds. And this is a review of the remediation and destruction techniques that are currently available or emerging that may be of use in remediation scenarios, but with a caveat that this area is evolving rapidly, and so there may be more methods that are becoming available on the market. And if people are aware of those and they're not covered in the guidance, we would encourage them to submit some comments directing us to any other methods or techniques that are out there. Next slide, please. So Module 5 provides guidance on the available technologies and techniques for all of the matrices, whether soil, sediment, groundwater, and wastes. We also look at sustainability issues, as I mentioned, with different technologies and their potential to release further POPs in the form of emissions or releases or residues. We have dedicated a whole section to PFAS contaminated site management, and we have received some very good comments in previous rounds that have added to our knowledge on this issue, and we've incorporated those in the previous comment round, and there's some very useful information there. Some of the technologies and techniques covered here are focused on degrading and removing POP contaminants in the environmental matrices to reduce the risk to receptors to acceptable levels. They may not necessarily destroy POPs in situ situations, but they can degrade them to relatively low levels. Other technologies have been assessed as capable of destroying or irreversibly transforming POP waste so that it no longer exhibits POP characteristics as required under sections of the Stockholm Convention. And in some cases, as I mentioned, treatment trains are discussed that can increase the efficiency and sustainability of the remediation and avoid the mass disposal of soils and sediments, because certainly in times past, many sites were remediated by simply digging up the entire mass and then depositing it somewhere else, perhaps in a landfill, which just shifted a lot of the problem without actually coming to a sustainable solution to the site that was affected. So wherever possible, we look at retaining soil mass and removing the contaminants. Next slide, please. And at this stage, I'll hand back to Bodwin.
Yes, thank you very much, Lee. We enter into Model 6, and Model 6 is called Technology Selection Tool for Remediation Options to be used in Phase 3, the remediation assessment. The table of contents after introduction, where it is explained that we use an example of a PCB contamination in soil and groundwater to walk you through the use of this tool to select the best remedial option. And therefore, in the first few sections of this model, we introduce PCB as a contaminant of concern. We just listed the selected remediation technology for PCB contaminated soil and PCB contaminated groundwater. This is of course related to the Model 5. Then we introduce the selection tool for the PCB contaminated soil and groundwater. And we give a motivation for the chosen applicability classes. Then we enter into the selection tool of the best remedial option, the criteria to select the best option, the selection of the visible remediation technique, and then the conceptual design of a visible remediation option and the selection of the best remedial option is all explained. And then we carry it out by using this example. And this example is called radiator site, and it's a PCB contaminated site. We first give the basic information of the site, summary of the conceptual site model and the results of the risk assessment, and then the selection of the remediation techniques using the tool, and then using the tool for the selection of the best option. And the last section is on the tendering of the best remedial options. There are different ways of tendering a project, and that is being discussed in this section 6. This model has a set of appendices. And Appendix 1 is the selection tool for the remediation technique for contaminated soil. And the soil of the selection of the remediation soil uses soil characteristics like the permeability the permeability of the soil in the first step. In the second step, it uses the concentration in the soil. The third step is the land use, and the last step to come to the correct technique or to the applicable technique is the availability of the remediation technique in the country. And we use a traffic light. Green is go ahead, this is applicable. Red is not, and then we have orange, you need to pilot or to test it. Now the same is done for the groundwater, and there we use the groundwater characteristics in the first step, the permeability of the aquifer. The second step, the groundwater depth, and then 3, the concentration, and then 4, the groundwater use, and the last step is the availability of the technique in the country. So meaning that you have to adapt or to fill in your own technique available in the country to use this tool. Then Appendix 3, 4, and 5 are examples of cost estimate for the maximum remedial option, the minimum remedial option, and the intermediate remedial options. These are these options designed, pre-designed for the selection of the best option. And then Appendix 6 is a tool to carry out a multi-criteria decision analysis with the options. Now, if we go to the next slide, I would like to focus on the fact that the remediation strategy should focus on the removal of pure POPs, and why removal of pure POPs is expensive. It costs you around 2 to 3 kilograms to bring it to an incinerator or to another disposal facility. But if you leave your waste, your POPs waste on site, it may spread into your soil and into your groundwater. If it spreads into your topsoil, the cost to get out the same kilogram, which was in waste 2 euros per kilogram, but now if you want to get out the same kilogram, it costs you a tenfold. It costs you 20 to 30 euros per kilogram. But if you still allow the contaminant, the POPs, to migrate, to spread in your soil profile, and it enters the subsoil, so to the deeper layers, it costs you more than 10 to even 100-fold to get out the same kilogram of POPs. Now, needless to say, if it enters the groundwater, it's even more. It mounts up to 1,000-fold to get out the same kilogram. So that is why we should focus on the removal of the pure pesticides. On the right-hand side, the remediation strategy is summarized in short term. Short term is, of course, removal of the waste and the topsoil contaminated. The midterm is the remediation of the subsoil, and long term is the remediation of the groundwater. Can I have the next slide? This slide pictures the process of the remediation assessment, which is explained in this module. But here you have your toolbox, the toolbox, which was actually all the techniques which were explained by Lee. And then you have your different site components, which is waste, POPs waste, slightly contaminated soil, moderately contaminated soil, and strongly contaminated soil. And for each of these site components, you can select a technique. For your strongly contaminated soil, XCT thermal treatment. You design a maximum remedial option, and maximum will say that you try to get rid of all your environmental risks. And you design your remedial option, your minimum remedial option. And there is, again, the same toolbox, but then you select containment, in situ containment, by phytotechnology. And for instance, for the strongly contaminated soil, you select ex situ containment. With these two extreme, you compose intermediate options. And all these options you subject to a multi-criterion decision analysis. And in this multi-criterion decision analysis, you judge or you assess the environmental risks, the cost, the legal aspects, and so on. And with that, you select the best remedial option. Can I have the next slide? Okay, Lee, it's you again.
Thank you, Bodwin. Module 7 looks at remediation from the standpoint of stakeholder engagement, public and worker safety and health. We provide guidance for site-specific stakeholder engagement and the different steps involved, whether it's planning, implementation, evaluation and reporting, and so on, and the duty of care and social responsibility, because in many cases, we look at safety issues as within the site that's being remediated, but not a lot of attention is paid to the surrounding community issues and their perceptions of the risk at the site, the actual risks they may encounter at the site, and so on, and the types of mitigation measures that are needed to put into place to ensure that the community is protected at least as well as the workers are protected on site. And under Section 6, we do highlight the health and safety issues for workers on site, including the placement of workplace amenities and first aid facilities, the need for exposure monitoring and health surveillance programs, to detect whether workers' protective equipment is satisfactorily functioning, or whether they're actually exposed, potentially from sources that may not be obvious. So the coverage of workplace issues, and Bodwin will comment a little bit more on this in future slides, is very important for the workers on the site, and how you lay out the site is important to that as well. And then just taking a step back, looking at issues related to transport and storage of POPs waste and POPs contaminated soils is very important on these sites. Interim storage of POPs waste and soil can prevent unnecessary exposure from wind-blown dust into the local area, rainwater ingress. You might have excavated piles of soil or waste and have them sitting on a hard stand, but in the event that you have heavy rains, they can be washed off. And so storage and how they need to be covered and under what sort of structures is important. And I know I'm working my way backwards a little here, but under section 4, looking at information, training and supervision of workers on site is just as important as providing protective equipment, because information and supervision is really critical in terms of ensuring that workers don't place themselves in unnecessarily hazardous situations within the site itself. And it may be unrelated to the actual contaminants. It can be related to heavy machinery, electrical issues, and so on. So all of that is very important. Next slide, please. Just a few more comments on stakeholder engagement. It's very important to conduct your public engagement, community engagement very early. It's a key aspect of managing POPs contaminated sites. And one of the key reasons for early engagement, apart from making sure that the community is in agreement with the process that's going forward, or at least is accepting of it, the local community may be able to provide historical information about the site, locations of potential hotspots, and maybe even related dumping locations off-site requiring investigation. And in my experience at quite a number of contaminated sites, this information has come from residents in the area who used to be truck drivers, former workers at the site, or supervisors at the site, and know where material was deposited decades ago, which can help enormously with developing sampling plans and locating those hotspots, and also potential secondary hotspots that are off-site related to dumping. Module 7 also provides guidance on planning, implementing and evaluating public consultation, so it contributes to making a safer and more effective management and remediation of the sites. And also we need to consider that while most contaminated sites investigation and remediation plans cover aspects of worker health and safety, they do often omit safety measures and emergency response that are important for the local community. Measures might need to consider potential releases of dust, hazardous fumes, contaminated rainwater erosion, emissions from remedial technologies, and other potential hazards that may impact the community. And Module 7 considers many of those issues. And just in the case of one contaminated site remediation I was involved in, we had a situation where there are alarms on site that would go off if the hazardous fumes reached a particular level. And during the day, those alarms never sounded. But in the middle of the night, they would, because of changes in temperature and weather conditions that caused a lot more of the fumes to be emitted and breach the safety levels. And if the community hadn't been alert to this and informing the practitioners what was happening, the exposures would have continued because there was no one on site overnight. So it required community reporting to bring that issue up. And just finally, safe interim storage of POPs waste and POPs contaminated soil and sediment is really important, both for worker safety and protection of those nearby communities. Next slide, please. And handing back over to Bodwin here.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. The model 8, not the last model, but the last model, is explaining phase number 4, the remediation management, the remediation itself, the digging, and then the installation of all kind of techniques. And then the last phase of the contaminated site management, which is the site monitoring and aftercare. This model starts with an introduction, and then the second section gives you some words about the tendering of a project, the detailed design of a remediation management project, the remediation management itself, what to do, how to manage, and how to get things safely done, and then the remediation evaluation and closure. And also here we have in the last subsection a format of reporting the results of a remediation. The next section introduced the monitoring and aftercare, and monitoring and aftercare is only implemented when you have remaining risk after phase 4, and that's often the case. You have plumes of groundwater, you may have still a bioremediation running on site, so that needs to be monitored, and that needs aftercare to sustain the result obtained in the previous phases. This section gives you some guidance on the organization of the monitoring and aftercare, and the last subsection gives you a format to report the results of the monitoring and aftercare. Can I have the next slide? Important aspect of the remediation management is, of course, health and safety, as Lee already said. And one important aspect is that you have to divide your remediation site, your area, in 3 zones. Zone 1 is the contaminated zone, there where the actually contamination is, where the process of remediation takes place. It's also called the red zone. Then you have the decontaminated zone, which is the area in your project area where you move from one zone to the other, where your personal protective equipment is, where your sluice is for your equipment to enter a contaminated site. And then the last zone is the clean zone, where you have your resting area, where you take your lunch and where you have your drinks. In the guidance of in the model 8, the rules to go from one zone to the other zone is explained. But each zone has a specific set of personal protective equipment. And of course, in zone 1, the contaminated zone, you have your maximum protection. So you use the maximum set of personal protective equipment. In the decontaminated zone, it's standard plus, depending on the situation. And in the clean zone, you always use your standard protection, personal protection equipment. Besides the division of your of your project site in these zones, which prevent exposure, you have your project risk management. I mean, there are all kinds of risks related to such operation. Traffic, for instance, working with heavy machinery, working on an excavation with a steep site. So what you have to do if you carry out or if you plan to carry out remediation, you have to assess all possible risks. You put it in a risk register. You select for each identified risk a control measure. You implement the control measure. You evaluate the control measure, and then you update your risk assessment. And then again, at regular intervals, you do this. If you have a project of, let's say, 3 months, every week you have a session to update this, to prevent and to implement control measures to prevent the risks. And below are, of course, the sequence of the implementing control measures. And the first and most important is eliminating your risks. Then transfer, redesign. You may go back to the design table and you say, this is too dangerous. We should design our project different. For instance, it could be a traffic plan, and the traffic plan is passing a school, and this is too dangerous. So you say, okay, no, we have to redesign the traffic plan, and that should go around this school. Then safety working systems. You may have chosen to use excavators, but that's too dangerous. So you are not going to use excavators, but you use, for instance, large diameters drills to get out the soil. And the last line of defense is your personal protective equipment. Next slide, please. That's for Lee. Lee, can you walk us through the last module?
Yes, I can. Module 9, getting started on legislation, policy, inventory development, and financing remediation. And the objective of this module is to draw together all of the elements once you've taken into account the previous modules, once you've understood the technical assessment that's necessary for the preparation in remediating a contaminated site, the identification and the characterization of the site. It's necessary, if you're going to build a framework for contaminated site management, to also have in place legislation and policy for POPs contaminated sites, and really for all contaminated sites in your country, but POPs are a subsection of those. And it's important that contaminated sites have a legal basis and policies that discuss how they should be managed. But just as important is developing a contaminated sites inventory. For many countries, they may have very rudimentary or disorganized records of contaminated sites. And so organizing those into a comprehensive inventory and moving from the early stages of pre-assessment to a formalized inventory is very important. And one of the reasons for this is that it's important to consider the relative risk between the different sites. And if you don't have an inventory listing those sites, it's very difficult to then go on to the other stages of identification, assessment, and characterization. So what section 3 in module 9 tries to cover is the stepwise approach to inventory development from the very earliest stages right through to a full inventory, and also how to look at the issue of developing inventories for newly listed POPs, which is something that's required under national implementation plans of the convention, that is to develop inventories of emissions and releases and so on, but also stockpiles, which can include contaminated sites. Another key aspect under section 4 is contaminated land acquisition and financing their remediation. So there are different models. In some cases, the remediation is financed by the polluter of the site. In some cases, it's the owner of the site who may not be the polluter. In some cases, it's joint ventures between government and other parties. And there are various financial instruments that can be applied to reach those objectives. And in terms of contaminated land acquisition, the legal and policy framework that's developed earlier has to take into account how land will be acquired or perhaps even resumed by government if the polluter cannot be found, if there is nobody willing to take responsibility or can be held accountable. In some cases, government may need to resume that land, make it government land, and then undertake remedial efforts. In other cases, there are models like developer-funded acquisition and remediation, where developers may buy the land for a discount, taking into account remediation costs, then develop the site and sell it, and hopefully make a profit. These are different models that are out there for financing remediation that are on the market. So it's important in terms of developing your model that all of these factors are taken into account and form a part of a comprehensive framework. Next slide, please. And this goes back a little under module 9 in terms of site prioritization to, if you recall the chart that Bodwin introduced, looking at risk levels, where you can calculate figures for the risk related to the site both within the site itself, and then giving a risk score that you can apply between sites. So when you're developing your inventory at the earliest stage, looking at the top peak of the red triangle and the corresponding site on the blue triangle, you might make an estimate before you've developed your inventory that there's more than 3,000 potential contaminated sites in the priority sector. You start to collate your inventory results, and you have 1,000 sites recorded. It's not as much as was estimated, but that's the result. And these are just hypothetical figures. But after you go through your stage-wise approach of preliminary investigation and risk assessment, you again can bring that down to 250 sites that are considered to be relatively higher risk. After conducting a tier 1 risk assessment, you can bring that down to 100 potential high-risk sites, and then following very detailed site investigation and a tier 2 or 3 risk assessment for sites in a selected cluster, you may arrive at 25 high-risk sites, and then with remediation of sites with confirmed high risk in selected cluster, you can perhaps drive that down to 10 sites that are top priority for your country to expend its resources on to get the process started. And a part of this whole guidance philosophy, if you like, or principle, is to treat those sites with the highest risk to make them as safe as they can be and reduce those risks to acceptable levels for the population and for the environment. And in many countries, resources will be limited, and site contamination cleanup can be expensive. And so you need to apply those resources in the most efficient possible way. And that's why the integration of risk assessment, site characterization, and inventory development allows you to do that. Thank you. Next slide. And back to
Lee, thank you very much. We are coming to the end of the presentation of this webinar, and I would like to conclude that the main message we try to submit is that contaminated site management should be in a phased approach, risk-based, and that the most important tool of this approach is the conceptual site model. In the first phase, after carrying out a site visit, desktop study, and reconnaissance survey, you can construct your initial conceptual site model. This initial conceptual site model is the input for phase 2. And to come to an investigation, you need to subject your initial conceptual site to the gap analysis. And the gap analysis gives you the information of a sampling analysis plan, and then you investigate and you confirm your source receptor pathways, and your receptors. It may be very well needed that a second round. I mean, often a first round of investigation is not enough to understand the contaminant situation on site. And there are cases that you need 3 to 4 rounds of investigation. So concerning the flexible work plan, please allow yourself to have enough time and budget to complete your conceptual site model in even several rounds of investigation. When you fully understand the on-site situation, you can enter the remediation assessment phase. And of course, you have confirmed that there are an acceptable risk on site. And the remediation assessment phase also is a phase of designing your remediation, selecting the best remedial option, but you may go back to the field, get samples and analyze the samples and update your conceptual site model. When that's done, you enter your remediation, the actual digging, the actual installation of a chemical oxidation plant or a pump and treat facility. By remediating a site, you change the on-site situation. So when you have completed your remediation, you have to update your conceptual site model to inform the site user, the site owner, on the current situation, and to, of course, also implement the next phase when you have remaining risks. That is the phase of the site monitoring and aftercare. Site monitoring and aftercare will be necessary to implement as long as there are remaining risks. The monitoring will report or record the data of, for instance, your groundwater plume, and that changes in time when your remediation, groundwater remediation is effective. So new data, new site data have to be recorded and used to update your conceptual site model. And in this way, the end result is also recorded in the updated conceptual site model for the user and for the site owner. I think this is, in a nutshell, what is, let's say, the whole content of the guidance. And I want to conclude with this. Lee, do you have any additional remarks on this?
No, I think that this graphic sums it up very well. And just to conclude that the phased approach to site remediation in a sustainable manner and environmentally sound manner is what we're seeking with the guidance. And I hope that we receive comments that help us to move further towards that final product. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee and Budwin, for this very interesting and precise presentation on the work under the guidance on contaminated sites.